Welcome back to Trekyards, everyone. I'm Captain Foley.
And I am Commander Cockings, and today we have a topic that I was very interested in learning about, and now that Stuart has done all the research and I get to enjoy it, and now we've done a read-through, I'm very eager to share it all with you because it's a cool topic.
That's right, Commander. Today we're going to be discussing the Romulan-Klingon alliance and technology exchange of 2267. Now, as usual in researching this information, I did use multiple sources as there's very little canon or screen information available. So we delve into the novels and games like Starfleet Battles and FASA to fill in some missing details about this historical treaty.
But let's start with the canon. So in the Season 3, Episode 4 of Star Trek the Original Series entitled The Enterprise Incident, after entering the neutral zone, the Enterprise is soon surrounded by Romulan ships. But these ships were actually the Klingon D7 class designs. Shocker. Scotty proclaims, that's a Klingon ship, but it couldn't be, not in this area. Spock responds, intelligence reports Romulans are now using Klingon designs. And I've got to jump in there. I obviously watched this a lot later, but even that first time I remember thinking, wait, what?
I remember thinking, man, I'm disappointed. I wanted to see more of the Romulan warbirds.
That too.
But the reason that it wasn't in the episode was because the actual model went missing in the meantime, so they had to use another enemy ship.
And then in Remastered they added it back, which was a nice touch. Or at least
Yes,
in
that
one of
was
the late ones as
beautiful.
well.
Yeah, they had 2 Klingon ones and 1 Romulan warbird, which was beautiful. This episode takes place in the year 2268, and as it turns out, the Klingon Empire and the Romulan Star Empire, along with the Federation, had jointly established a colony on Nimbus 3 the prior year in 2267. They officially declared it the Planet of Galactic Peace.
And Waterpool.
And alien catwomen that have light bones so Kirk can lift them over his head and throw them. Because he's not that strong. The colony quickly became an embarrassing failure for all 3 governments, however, although regular meetings between representatives did take place at the colony for at least the next 20 years. This action, however, made it possible for the Klingons and Romulans to begin talks and establish a precarious treaty with one another against the Federation late in 2267.
I didn't realise that was the start of it all. It's nice that things have some symmetry.
Neither did I, actually, so yeah.
But it makes total sense. But this alliance offered both sides a strategic advantage in their conflicts with the United Federation of Planets, as well as other powers along their borders, and ultimately resulted in a technology exchange between these 2 powers. And not much else, as each empire never actually trusted the other. Not surprised. The alliance was, in truth, more of a friendship of convenience than an actual alliance of political powers. Both sides had something that they wanted from each other, and once those exchanges actually occurred, things fell apart rather quickly. But we'll talk about the death of the treaty at the end of the episode.
The main reason for the alliance was because the Romulans had been developing a new enhanced Mark 3.1 cloaking device, but these required a far more powerful and stable power supply than the older versions of the cloaking screens that they just recently tested against the Federation. And the Romulans didn't have the ships that could produce that much power with their older style warp cores. In fact, the Romulans were one of the races that attained warp speed much later than other species in the quadrant, and as a result, their ships were much slower than other big superpowers at the time. So they also wanted to acquire some of the Klingons' more advanced, higher speed warp developments as well.
So it kind of sounds like the Romulans started with less, and then they really tried to make up the gap with the Pterodexes and the cloak and the powerful weapons. They seemed to try and...
you got to think, too, they were basically refugees from Vulcan. They didn't have a lot when they got to Romulus, so it did take them longer to develop the infrastructure to build these systems and things. So.
I'm sure they wanted to be different and prove their own culture and things, so yeah, very interesting.
I can imagine the ships that they used to escape Vulcan were probably not the best. The most advanced ships. They were probably slower, older cargo ships. So
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So, Proconsul Tekel suggested an alliance with the Klingons, as they had ships that could in fact produce sufficient power. The newly developed version of the D7, famous ship there. Her plan was endorsed by Praetor Vrax and given the go-ahead by the Senate. So negotiations began behind the backs of the Federation representatives, with Grodak, a minor Klingon diplomat. These negotiations would lead to the full alliance, in which much technology would be shared between the empires.
The Klingons would acquire the Romulans' older-style Mark II cloaking systems, as the Romulans wanted to keep the new Mark 3.1 a closely guarded secret, even from their new allies, so as to gain the upper hand in the quadrant.
That's such a Romulan thing.
It is. The Romulans are sneaky buggers. The 2 sides worked together to install the devices on Klingon vessels and tested their effectiveness in mock war games, which also had the side result of allowing the Klingons to develop new improved tactics for use with cloaking technologies. By 2269, a small percentage of the Klingon fleet possessed cloaking technology, mainly the larger, newer capital ships, and the Klingons made minor improvements to help integrate the cloaking technology with their own systems. The cloak was never perfect on these Klingon ships, as these were older units, however, and in some instances had a visible shimmer or distortion, as well as limitations in sensor masking against various emissions. Some of these deficiencies were eliminated by Klingon scientists and engineers over the years, but never quite matched the cloaking technology of the Romulans themselves.
I mean, reverse engineering anything is very different to inventing or building it from the start, so bound to be.
And integrating different technology with your own sometimes is a real hassle.
They also acquired plasma weapons technology, but not complete plasma systems, however. Again, the Romulans specifically left components and information regarding that specific system out, stating the weapons were merely experimental and never really worked as anticipated. Ignore the fight with the Federation where they blew up colonies. That didn't really work. So after
the ship got destroyed.
Yeah, exactly. It's an overload. Totally the weapon's fault. So after years of failed attempts to integrate these new plasma weapon designs into the Klingon fleet without burning all the systems shipwide, when charging or firing the devices occurred, or simply having the technology explode, well, they really should have stopped this sooner rather than later, the Klingons eventually gave up the new weapons technology. Some Romulan ship designs and their schematics were also exchanged and allowed the Klingons to begin using Romulan-inspired ships and designs, as well as superiorly strengthened armor plating present on most Romulan warships.
The Romulans, however, got exactly what they had needed. After working together with the Klingons to integrate most of their power systems, to work together with Romulan tech, they even allowed the Klingons to help develop and test the Mark III cloak. That, while being slightly better than the one supplied to the Klingons, was not the final Mark 3.1 version that the Romulans ultimately intended on using. Besides weapons, transporters, and even a few of the Klingons' mind sifter devices, the Romulans acquired many Klingon D7s as well as other small vessels, such as D5s, D6s, and various others. The new Romulan D7s became known as the K-class. These D7s were completely overhauled, and certain Klingon systems were removed altogether or modified to suit the Romulan requirements. Many had new nacelles installed, boom separation components and security systems removed and replaced with backup generators and auxiliary batteries and power supplies, and some weapon systems replaced with plasma torpedo launchers as well. The vessels also sported new Romulan paint schemes, and these vessels were labeled as V-11 Stormhawks.
Nice, good name. Another reason for the Klingons wanting this alliance was the direct response to the Organian peace treaty, since they themselves could no longer wage war with the Federation due to the interference of the Organians. They had hoped they could use the Romulans to accomplish this goal and join them in glorious war with the Federation. The Romulans also wished to squash the fledgling Cardassian Union, which was on the march, annexing systems around their sphere of influence, and they used the alliance to contain the Cardassians from their early outward expansion and relegated them to a much smaller area of space than I'm sure the Cardassians would have liked.
The Cardassians do like their power, don't they? The Alliance also freed up much of the Klingon fleet from Federation border patrol so that they could deal with the Kzinti and Tholians, which were causing issues on some of the Klingons' other borders. In comparison, the addition of new, faster warp technology made the Romulans much more of a threat, as they were now able to deliver their devastating plasma-based weaponry deeper into enemy territory at a much faster pace. This made their war against the Gorn hegemony much more hostile, resulting in much of the Romulan fleet being assigned and focused on the Gorn border for the years between TOS and TNG. So that would be why we didn't see much of the Romulans for quite a while by TNG.
And they just had to build that darn fleet of Derridexes in secret. It's like, nope, we're gonna rock out with the biggest ships anyone's ever seen.
Well, in Starfleet Battles, the Gorn also have plasma-based weaponry, so it's plasma torpedo against plasma torpedo. So they needed to have the advanced ships, the bigger ships.
A quarter of a century is all the alliance would last, however, as the year 2292 saw the end of the Romulan-Klingon alliance, as both sides had essentially got what they wanted, and very deep-seated distrust for one another, and with good cause. As it turned out, each side was operating their own agenda the entire time. No surprise! And were keeping secrets from one another. The Klingons were using unmarked D7s to participate in hit-and-run raids on Federation supply convoys and border outposts to cause instability in the quadrant to make the Federation think the Romulans responsible for such devious acts of aggression. This also allowed the Klingons to attack Federation assets without technically being in violation of the Organian Peace Treaty, although you would think if they were really powerful, advanced, evolved life forms, they could detect, oh wait, that paint is wrong. They're
yeah. I thought the same thing when I wrote that, but it does make sense somewhat. I mean, Anyway, another contributing factor in the breakdown of relations was simply the fact that the Klingons were quick to turn their noses up at Romulan culture. The Klingons openly mocked Romulan traditions and outright broke Romulan law when it suited them. They then returned to their ships to avoid the legal consequences and repercussions. According to many who witnessed the alliance firsthand, the Klingons on Romulus acted more like a military occupying force than that of an ally.
This resulted in a bitter blood feud between the two empires, and distrust on each side ran rampant. Occasionally some small deals were made between these two major factions when it suited their needs, but this was never anything substantial or even officially acknowledged over the years following the alliance. One such instance occurred in 2346 when the Romulans turned on the Klingons at Khitomer. It was this incident that was responsible for the death of Worf's parents. Small skirmishes even occurred during the official 25-year alliance, however, over territory, technology, and political ideologies. Spies from both sides routinely supplied their respective governments with intel right up through the TNG years.
And there you have it, guys. A kind of brief look at the alliance.
Brief? That was very in-depth, Stu. I learned so much.
Well, thank you. As I said earlier to you, getting all these from different sources and putting it together, it was challenging but interesting. I learned a lot. So
yeah, it seems very cohesive. But let's have a quick discussion, Stu, about what we think about this alliance and you know, these races, how they could come together, and the technology, and having the D7. I mean, what do you think about, I guess, retrospectively on this whole future alliance?
I mean, it makes sense. Knowing the Klingons and the Romulans, how devious they are, to get an upper hand on the Federation, which was really kind
blossoming.
They were expanding and exploring, and they had the new Constitution class ships, the upgraded ones, and they were really going to be a force to be reckoned with. And the Romulans didn't have the technology they needed to be sneaky and infiltrate Federation space without the new cloak. But so use each other, and hopefully I'm sure they started out thinking that the alliance would be like a strong union, something that could take on the Federation, but with the benefit of gaining technology. And then it just turned out to be basically a technology exchange, because they never really worked together, I don't think, because they didn't trust each other.
You know, my take on this is that it was more a case of it was the right thing at the right time. There were certain political parties in both empires that had the power to say, let's make this thing happen. You know, a certain senator in Romulus said, well, what if we did this? And they listened at that time, and the idea was so great. But as soon as the cultures intermingled, as soon as people actually started talking, because they're very different cultures, they really are.
Ooh,
in terms of the little things especially. Once that was all worked out, then they realised, we can't be this great empire. I mean, each one, I think, if given the opportunity, would want to be the dominant empire in the galaxy, in all the quadrants, which is not something that, you know, I mean, the Klingons have it. I guess that's more their nature, and I think the Romulans want to prove to not be Vulcans. They've got some level of really inbred need to prove themselves to be dominant. You know, they weren't dominant on Vulcan. They lost that battle, so maybe they can win again. But I think, you know, it fell apart just because they're too different. And, you know, especially in TNG, there's so many times Worf was saying, you know, there's so much hate, real hate.
Yeah.
You know, racism in a sense, and we don't get that very often between races. It's normally somewhat, Klingons there, but that was really, you know, obviously killed his parents. But a lot of hate, especially because they had an alliance. I mean, it's interesting that the canon would give you two opposite sides within 100 years.
Yeah. One interesting thing I thought was one of the last points I made, where the Klingons on Romulus were very much like a military occupying force, and I can definitely see that. And disrespecting Romulan culture. I mean, we've seen the Klingons on Deep Space Nine, for example, you know, being ruckus and, you know, headbutting each other and causing fights, and that's just what they do. The Romulans are not ones to get in fist fights. You know what I mean?
Disruptors first.
Yeah. It's a totally different political and ideological views and stuff. So I can see that being a huge issue. And even in Deep Space Nine, again, the Romulans talking about when they're trying to get the Romulans on board with the Alliance, talking about the distrust of the Klingons. It's mentioned a few times. It's just this deep-seated, it's just ingrained in their minds that they can't trust each other. And I think it all goes back to this incident specifically. So I love that that's a kind of a tie-in.
Well, it's one of those odd things, like in TOS it was kind of strange that we hadn't seen a Romulan before, so we didn't know they had the same pointy ears. So it's likely that at that time the Klingons and Romulan culture, they barely knew anything about each other. So suddenly it's obviously you have this sense of, well, maybe we could be allies. But as soon as you literally meld the two cultures out, having some people on Romulus, some people on Kronos, whatever, then all these real we don't work comes to the surface. We didn't even know a lot of this stuff until TNG about how the Federation would deal with Romulans. And you mentioned DS9. Yeah, I mean, I think back to the first time, they've just fled from Cardassia or something. They're the allies, and they're doing a pit stop at DS9, and they've been allies for the Federation for a long time at this point. Kitamo, Star Trek 6, a long time. Everyone that's on these ships either is as old as the Alliance or was young when it was, and then older people as well. But most people, it's been their entire life, almost, or at least a high percentage. And yet, some things they were doing to just completely, there's a great scene in the bar where they just have a fight, and it's like, this is totally against all the rules, yet they're in the space where you can't do that, and yet they just don't care. So give them a bit more time, give them a bit more of a real alliance feel. We're going to strike at the Federation eventually, that confidence. And they're just butting heads, and although and the Romulans didn't even have the new ridges to be able to deal with the head punching, they're still
maybe
that's
why they developed those. Maybe that's why they developed those, so they could take on the Klingon headbutting. And ironically enough, then the Klingons lose those in Enterprise. Wow, everybody wants to change their foreheads. I don't know, but yeah, we even see like the Romulans conspiring with the Klingons all through TNG with the whole
Duras, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, the Duras, yeah. So there's always those factions within these political systems that want to stir up trouble and actually try to get an upper hand by doing that kind of thing. So,
well, that's a great example.
I love it.
Well, yeah, I said it just takes one person, so it takes the Duras. That's all it takes, that one person who puts them in position. I mean, they got Sealer onto Kronos. That's pretty, that's a pretty serious thing to do. I mean, I guess also Picard and Datacon, but it's the head of this government. Yeah. And what do you think about the actual technology exchange itself? And obviously we know the TOS story didn't have the model. Let's just reuse this, and this one little thing set all these things in motion.
I think it's genius. I mean, what a better way to solve a problem. Plus, they didn't really consider that the show was going to be as big as it was, or be watched in syndication and like nitpicked apart.
Yeah.
So.
Well, hey, you had quite a cohesive story there, so nitpick if you want to, but that's pretty cohesive.
Well, yeah, it's just retconning, I guess. This whole thing is just retconning. Even TNG, where they're like they had an alliance or whatever. Yeah. But it makes sense that that's why the Klingons have the cloaking technology that we first saw with the Romulans, and even in Star Trek 3, there's a visible shimmer to the bird of prey. Like, it wasn't a perfect cloak. Like, we know the Romulans, their perfect cloak. Even in Balance of Terror, it was a better cloak, I think, because the Enterprise had a real hard time. Of course, that was different sensors and stuff, but cloaking system.
I mean, we if you look at because I mean the Klingons, they had cloaks at the end of the show, did they? In the end of TOS, or did they not have cloaks and they only had cloaks later on?
I don't think they ever mentioned cloaks on TOS.
So the first time they had cloaks was obviously Star Trek 3, which was the...
No, the first time they had cloak was in the animated series. One of the Klingon ships was using cloak. So, yeah. Okay, and that goes back to the whole... When I said the newer capital ships, the new capital ships, the D7s, were using the new cloak. Yeah.
We postulated, obviously, talked about this in our original Enterprise era Bird of Prey, and I loved the idea that, the Klingon culture was a certain way. All these ships, sort of familiar-ish designs, but no cloaks, so they're all about guns, they're all about offensive, and then suddenly a cloak, we're sharing this, the one real advantage the Romulans have, it gets shared, and how do the Klingons reutilize that? The Bird of Prey goes from being this outfitted piece of gear, and they use the Romulan influence, how to utilize a cloak properly to build this new bird of prey, which has obviously the backstory that we've talked about many times, but has this cloak. The style of combat is a lot different. That it changes, and with bigger ships and smaller ships, and it's interesting how that one thing changed. I mean, could you imagine the Klingons without cloaks? All these stories, all these things. I mean, Star Trek 6 wouldn't happen, and but I love the fact that the Romulans always have better cloaks.
Yeah.
But you sort of forget that really they started from the same place, and you think, who had cloaks first? I mean, obviously Enterprise retconned the Enterprise era Romulans having cloaks.
Mm-hmm.
But then Suliban had cloaks, but Sulibans had cloaks because of Future Guy.
Yeah.
But were Sulibans the first to actually build them, or maybe they found a Suliban ship and to sell their cloak? I mean, who did cloaks first? Suliban non-organically was the Romulans really the first guys? Maybe the Future Guy was a part of the Romulan sect, so the Romulans gave the Suliban cloaks in the future. I mean, it's interesting to... I don't know. It's I like the idea of... Because, they don't have a cloak. We've all had the idea of let's be invisible. Our superheroes that just have the power of invisibility. And so all these races would have thought, let's try and build a cloaking device. So it's interesting to think who was the first person to actually crack it. And once they did, the Klingons just used their tech. The Federation based their 2 cloaks off Romulan tech. That we never developed it ourselves. Mm. So technically we built a better one and built transphasic. But that's a separate thing. So it's interesting. I like the idea of who came up with cloaks first. Who originated it.
And it depends on where you look at the source material, because in Starfleet Battles, it was, if you look at the history, there's a history in the beginning of the Starfleet Battles book of the development.
I just want to remind the audience what Starfleet Battles is, for those who don't remember.
Oh, sorry. Starfleet Battles is a tabletop game from the 80s. Yeah. It's just strategy-based, and you have to ships fighting each other. Great stuff, and a lot put into it.
And it was in the vacuum between TOS, TAS, and the movie, so this was in the vacuum. This was the new Star Trek, as it were, at the time.
Yeah. But in that history, it is the Romulans that developed cloaking technology first, but with such underpowered warp cores, they needed that leg up to kind of get themselves out of that bog that they were in, because they were technologically inferior to every other race around them, because they were refugees from Vulcan, and they didn't have the infrastructure and stuff when they reached Romulus. So that would explain their deficiencies in actually gaining that upper hand. So their thing was developing cloak first, so to be sneaky, because they weren't fast, they weren't powerful, and then they came up with the plasma weaponry, which was super powerful. I mean, 1 hit from a plasma torpedo, your shields are down. 2 hits, you're pretty much destroyed in Starfleet Battles. They're pretty powerful weaponry. So invisibility and powerful weapons. What do you need next? Speed. Yep. And to do that, they had to make the alliance with the Klingons. Also gave them a better power core so that they could develop a better cloak. And then, of course, we know by TNG they have the quantum singularity drive, which is far more advanced than any matter-antimatter systems. Who knows where they got that from? Maybe they made a treaty with somebody for that. Who knows? Or
maybe. Or that was their other second... I mean, they're obviously an advanced race by that point.
Yeah.
They're
super smart. They're Vulcans, right? Essentially.
Yeah.
Vulcans with an attitude towards war. Of course, they're going to develop weaponry.
Although, again, I mean, I was just thinking this. I mean, the Romulans have never been specifically the race that goes out and conquers. They had, like in TOS, you didn't get the sense that the Romulans were beginning this big war, this big campaign. The Klingons were the aggressors. The Romulans were this other faction. They've got the neutral zone we set up. So we had the Romulan War, but that was obviously in the past. That was for a reason, sort of thing. But beyond that, we don't see them go out and... I never got the sense they were a warlike race per se. So the cloak makes sense. That's how they do things. That's how and the Klingons help jump that. But even through TNG, they weren't at least attacking the major races. Even in TNG, they weren't... You know what I mean? There is no... They're more content to be in their own space, probably doing stuff in the shadows and then taking over systems by other means and then developing technology. I mean,
And I think something that a lot of TNG fans ignore or don't know about is the fact that each sphere of influence, like for political, has other borders with other races that have warp technology as well. So there are skirmishes and stuff going on in the background that you don't know about because it's not one of the major players in the Alpha or Beta quadrants, right?
Yeah.
And that's what Starfleet Battles was about. The Gorn, the Tholians, the Kaczynski, the Hydrans, the Interstellar Concordian. There's a whole bunch of different races that are all vying for power. A lot of them are a lot smaller, but they, cause problems with some of the big influential races. And that's something that you don't really get much of a feel for in TNG. It's like, oh, there's the Klingons, the Romulans, and the Federation. That's it.
And the Cardassians. Oh, we had a war with them. Hey, they're here now.
Yeah, things like that,
Yeah.
So that's one thing I like about Starfleet Battles and stuff, the fleshing out of the kind of more of the political landscape of the quadrants is really interesting. So,
which is why I like the Star Wars Expanded Universe books and games. The exact same thing, but visually as well.
Yeah.
So I think that's just about it, Stuart. Talking about this alliance, I learned a lot from this episode. We had a good discussion. It was a clever way of saving money, but turned into this wonderful concept that then, you put the pieces, you see the pieces, and they all come together, and it's this nice little. I like it. It's good. It's a good piece of history, and hopefully you guys enjoyed learning all about it.
Yeah, and if you know anything else about it, any interesting facts, put them in the comments below, and I'm sure people would love to read them and learn from you guys as well. So, as you said, I learned a lot doing this research as well. I thought I knew a lot about this. It turns out I didn't know quite as much as I thought, but that's one thing I love about working on this show. So, Anyway, guys, if you liked the episode, click the like button. And if you want to help us out, you can head over to Trekyards.com. There's a big donate button, and it helps us do future episodes. There's also a link to our Patreon page there as well. So click that, and you can help us on a monthly basis, because these episodes take time to research, write, film, edit on Samuel's end. And it's a lot of work involved in one of these. And we do it because we love it, but at the same time, we want to keep doing it. So if you could help us, it'd be greatly appreciated.
But if you can't donate even that $1 a month, then please just share on Facebook, Twitter, Reddit, anywhere you think Star Trek fans would enjoy our work, our hard work, Stuart's hard work in scripting and then us presenting. And if you make sure when you subscribe to the channel, because we have so much great Star Trek content almost every day and sometimes every day. And make sure you hit that bell notification though, so that you get our episodes every single time, and just tune in for every other episode, because we do it for you guys and hope you enjoy. So until next time, guys. He is Captain Foley.
And he's still Commander Cockings, and we still have an alliance between us.
I was about to ask, who's the Klingon, who's the Romulan, if we were to...
Ooh. Off the cuff, I want to say that you're the Romulan, but I'm not really super aggressive, so I don't know if I'd be a Klingon. I think we're both Romulans.
Yeah.
I think we're good. But anyway, guys, if you want to join our alliance with us, you can do so. Click the subscribe button as well. And until next time, we'll see you all later. Bye, guys.
Bye, guys.